So this is kind of the overarching theme for this seminar. So what I'll do is, so I'll just read this. So in this seminar, we have invited academics, global civil society, international circuit artists, and potential funders in navigating these complexities of this type of return, helping to provide clear pathways towards navigating material and knowledge transfer, but also what we call repatriating practices for repatriated heritage. When I say repatriation, of course, it's kind of an iffy term, but we want to emphasize looking at work on top of the return, which emphasizes a relational process that aims to establish source community-based spaces for co-producing knowledge about collections and creating community-led methods for redefining the value and significance of material heritage. So the implementation of this project will provide insights to similar situations or contexts in island Southeast Asia. The Tivoli situation finds broad similarity. Heretofore, a small-scale culture of shifting agriculturists, you might say, who have been settled by missionaries and national government within the last half century. So, and compounding that with the loss of a lot of the artifacts of these indigenous cultures, two major museums outside of the Philippines. So, and on top of that as well is this sort of thirst for reconnecting with ancestral knowledges from indigenous peoples themselves. So this repatriation formulation that integrates museological archival work with grassroots self-empowerment agenda will hopefully also inform similar initiatives among island Southeast Asian cultures. So for the first panel, I've invited two speakers who have been working and compiling information about repatriation, asking them to emphasize on practical case studies of of repatriation of non-monumental material culture under research in Western collections, but holding enormous significance to that country. So, introducing the first speaker, Amy Shakespeare, is an international repatriation specialist. She is currently working to implement the Association and American Indian Affairs International Repatriation Strategy. As an HRC-funded PhD researcher at the University of Exeter, her research aims to enable more European museums to undertake repatriation through anti-colonial processes. The second speaker, and they will be in conversation after this, is Louis McNaught. I kind of found him because of his excellent website with a lot of information. I put the link there. So Mr. McNaught is the founder and managing editor of returningHeritage.com. And it's a non-for-profit online resource established in 2019 to provide reliable, up-to-date information about cultural restitution. Most of his professional career has been spent in the arts, including 5 years working in the Department of Egyptian Antiquities at the British Museum and 13 years as CEO of the Mall Galleries in London. So without much ado, I'm going to ask the two speakers to come over. And then we begin with Amy. So what? Yeah. Oh, you would?
I don't. So I can do the slide.
Yeah.
Is it on then?
Yeah. Okay. So we'll start with Amy, and then please feel free to kind of jump in after the presentation. We really want this to be practical and kind of yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Cristina, for inviting me to speak today. And this is my first time at SOAS, so I'm very excited to be here and that the room is so full. I think these conversations are super important. Cristina has already introduced me, so my name has been large. I'm Amy. And I really was intrigued by the sort of description of the panel that Cristina put together to really focus, as she says, on the kind of practical logistics and ethical considerations generations of repatriation. And so I wanted to focus today on a couple of case studies from two very different museums in the UK, one that returned a number of belongings and one that returned a very large cultural item. And as in my own research, I want to think about what can be learned from these returns and these processes, what is replicable and what perhaps needs to change in future. So I always start from the point that repatriation is a human rights issue. I'm not the only person to do that because it is in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And there are a number of articles that directly or indirectly support repatriation as a human rights issue for Indigenous peoples within this declaration. But Article 12.2 is perhaps the most sort of overt of these, where it says states shall seek to enable the access and or repatriation of ceremonial objects and human remains in their possession through fair, transparent and effective mechanisms developed in conjunction with the Indigenous peoples concerned. So maybe thinking about the case studies that I'm going to talk about and whether they have delivered on this. So I really, in my work, am not interested in if museums should return, but I really look at the how and how it can be a more anti-colonial process if possible. So I want to start by looking at a small council-run museum in the middle of England in a very rural location in Derbyshire that originally opened in 1893. And there are a particular set of circumstances that led to this small, perhaps unlikely museum undertaking this work. They're run by Derbyshire County Council, and they had a school library service that had been set up in 1936 to create collections of museum quality artefacts to be taken into schools for the pupils to see and learn about. And so, following budget cuts and changes to the national curriculum, as so often happens, the service was closed in 2018, and that meant that 2,000 items were returned to the museum. And the museum undertook this process of ethical disposal to relocate a number of the items to other museums, archives, and trusts and foundations, both in the UK and abroad. But within the collection, there were 51 Native Nations and First Nations cultural artefacts, which Brett Gónô said did not really fit in with the collection, which very much focuses on the history of the Peak District. So again, you see how these items are not used, they're in storage, they weren't going to be on display, as is so often the case. And it was at this point that Brett Gónô, who was the curatorial assistant at the museum, realised that they could run a repatriation project. So he became one of 10 curators in the UK to be awarded a share of the £300,000 funding from the Headley Fellowship in 2022. And he decided to take a proactive approach to repatriation. So many museums take a very reactive approach, responding when they are asked, but he was going out to Indigenous nations to ask if they would like their belongings returned. And he reflected how every nation had the same reaction, which was, really? What's the catch? And he was saying, no, all returns will be unconditional. And I kind of want to pose the question of how do museums do more of this work proactively when they have such limited funds and limited capacity? Another unusual thing was that with the project funding, the belongings returned via parcel force, which you may be familiar with, because he did seek a quote from a professional art courier who specialised in shipping items from museums, and the quote from the professional courier was £7,500 versus the £280 that Parcel Force charged. Of course, he checked with the nations that they were happy for this route, which would enable the items to return. So despite the fact that he had this funding from the Headley Fellowship, the £7,500 was beyond the budget of the project. And this demonstrates not only how expensive this work is, but how it needs to be properly funded. Brett was also asked to travel to Haida Gwaii separately to the belongings, but at the same time, so that they arrived within days of one another. He had accompanied them as he'd been requested to do so by the Haida Nation, who are in, some of whom are in this picture. And he had a meal with members of the Haida Nation and the Repatriation Committee at the Haida Gwaii Museum, where they spoke about the belongings that had returned home. And my research and others have found how individuals are so crucial to this work. You know, Brett really took it upon himself to undertake this, to apply for the funding and to do this work. And although it was a council-run museum, the council didn't understand why he needed to accompany the items to Haida Gwaii. And I think it really highlights that those who make the decisions often don't understand repatriation. They're your councillors, they're your trustees. So we need to think about how do we improve the understanding of these decision makers. Yes, they change often. Councillors are voted in and out, trustees are voluntary positions, but they still need to be brought along on the journey. Another part of my research looks at how museums interpret in 2023 the Vistula Memorial Pole returned home via repatriation to the Nisga'a Nation, who are based in what is now known as British Columbia. They returned home from the National Museum Scotland, and as a national museum they are governed by the Scottish Museum Act. And this act says that objects can only leave the collection if there are duplicates, if they can no longer be an effective part of the collection, or they are infested. However, unlike the historic legislation that governs the British Museum, for example, they also have an ability to make a recommendation or request to the Minister of Culture in Scotland for repatriation. So in view to do more of this work, in 2020 they published their procedure for considering requests for the permanent transfer of collection objects to non-UK claimants. And they didn't get a request under this procedure until 2022, but that might be because people didn't know it existed, which is why I have my website Routes to Return, which I can talk about a bit later. The Nisga'a had previously been told that the pole was too old to move, but in their research they found that the pole had been moved twice previously, relatively recently, as part of the museum's redevelopment. So don't believe everything that museums tell you, if you didn't know. And I want to talk a little bit about how Nisga'a Nation's planning and strategy were crucial for the return of the pole, and how this repatriation is leading the museum to make changes to their 2020 procedure. Essentially, the Nisga'a Nation rejected the procedure because it was based on a colonial Western ontology. They told the museum that it's not relevant for discussion. They said, we're not just talking about semantics, but we saw that there was a fundamental, different ontological and epistemological difference in understanding the living and spiritual nature of the pole. Sacred belongings cannot be owned, policies only apply to objects as property, and they provided evidence that the pole was more than an object or property that they could own, and they also highlighted international law such as UNDRIP. And so here are three sort of ways that they did this. The NMS procedure states that they require a formal written request, which lots of museum repatriation policies do. And the Nisga'a Nation had visited and made an oral presentation to the museum, which was recorded and then later accepted as the request. The policy also states that requests from communities and Indigenous nations require endorsements from the national government and a recognised national agency. So the museum expected the Canadian government to back the Nisga's request. And the Canadian government said, no, we have a treaty with the Nisga'a, they're a self-governing nation, and we have no authority over them. And this forced the museum to recognise the Nisga'a government as the national government, and therefore the Nisga'a Museum as the national agency. And although the Nisga'a had to convince the museum to work with them directly, nation to nation, I do think that is a key example of the powerful potential that international repatriation holds as a way for institutions to support, recognise and uphold Indigenous sovereignty. And finally, one of the other things the policy says is that a request should give as much information and evidence as possible. And Dr. Amy Parent, who is Niska herself and also an associate professor and scholar, did her own research. And not only did she find that the pole had already been moved twice, so this couldn't be used as an excuse, but also that Marius Barbeau, who took the pole, had kept detailed records of where he took it from, when he took it, and who he bought it from. The museum claimed that he had legitimately purchased the pole and they had receipts, but the person in the records did not have the cultural authority to sell the pole as they were not the matrilineal owner. And Dr. Amy Parent said she wanted to challenge the colonial archive by publishing a book chapter outlining her research, which was then submitted as key evidence that the museum used in their report to their board, and the museum had to admit that it had not been bought. So the museum are now making it explicit that oral testimony is equally as valid as written, looking at how they define what a nation is and making that explicit in the procedure. And they're also looking at how they enter into collaborative working before a decision is made, before a claim is made, so that they can use collaborative, transparent methods throughout. And I think this highlights that consultation with Indigenous nations and other key stakeholders concerned in repatriation is key in the development of policies and procedures. So I just put these quotes up, which I think are really powerful, but I also want to state that the Niska Nation also stated that media advocacy they did prior to and after their initial visit to Scotland were key to their success. They pointed out in media about UNDRIP and UK's commitment, and they used press interviews with major Canadian and Scottish media outlets to report what was happening during those media meetings, which created tension with the museum, which worked to the nation's benefit. And Dr. Amy Perron hired a publicist through her research grant, which she said was critical to the success of the effort. They had access to media outlets, so they could plan stories and interviews, holding the narrative from the beginning. And they talked about how the policy really garnered control to the museum and then to the board. And one of the things they were really disappointed about on their arrival was that there was no one present from the board. And when the Niska asked why, they were told that the board needed to remain objective because they were making a final decision on return. And the Niska said there is no such thing as objectivity in a colonial institution that has total power over our belongings and pressures to meet the chair of the board. And again, these are the decision makers. How do museums involve them and take them along and remove this idea that there should be objectivity? Because we know that individuals who are involved in this work often are more committed in future to doing more. And the Niska Nation now say that they have a positive relationship with the museum since the decision has been made. And Dr. Amy Parent says so many people have gone above and beyond in their jobs in order to get the pole home to us. Again, highlighting the importance of the individuals. So just to finish up, as well as continuing work on my own website, in the last couple of weeks I published a policy briefing for the UK government aiming to use some of the learnings from looking at these processes and what can be learned. So looking at the UK honouring its commitment to UNDRIP, it's one of the few things that we can actually actively work on in this country to support the rights of Indigenous peoples. Looking at providing those specific ongoing long-term funds for provenance research, training and skills programmes, and crucially the physical return of ancestors and belongings, which is often where these requests fall down because neither the museum or the Indigenous nation has the money to fund the physical return. And the idea of this research isn't for an academic purpose. Museums don't know what they have, they don't know how many ancestors, which belongings they have in their collections. And then also looking at having a national policy that enables institutions to act autonomously on the institution, so that, on repatriation, so that this work doesn't get swallowed up by national governments trying to use it for political gain, although, there's different ways to approach that. And national museums and galleries to be given the powers needed to act independently on repatriation, which they currently are not able to do. I am hopeful that the new government may lead to new opportunities. There have been some good interest since the briefing was launched, and Lisa Namdi has been quoted as saying that they are looking at repatriation, so I will remain hopeful until proven otherwise. But that's all I have to say. Thank you so much for your time.
What should we do? Do you have questions, or should we go on to the next? Let's do first, and then we'll do it again. Okay.
I should say there's a lot of synergy between Amy's presentation and mine. Not least because I live in Stratford-upon-Avon, where we have another very famous Shakespeare. I've got to ad lib on the other slides. About some restitution jokes, maybe, or something. Actually, I agree with a great deal of what Amy said, probably everything that Amy has said. I may have a slightly different take on the output and how we're going to get there, but we'll, here we are. I've got to shout every time I want to change a slide, so don't feel I'm being rude, please. Also, you may feel at times that I'm giving a heavy promotion for this website. Well, I am. It's absolutely free. I'm never going to sell you anything. There is absolutely no cost to subscribe. The reason why subscription is important is because we're getting a huge amount of coverage now in the media. So we're getting on BBC TV, I was on Australian radio the other night. So we are getting a lot of traction from people finding this website. And the more subscribers we have, the more power we have, particularly as we're moving into this next phase, which is a government phase, which is actually start turning the role of government. Next. It's called returningHeritage.com. Because there is a bit of overlap, I'll hurry through some of the first slides, by the way. As I said, absolutely free. There's a subscription button, press it. I'm never going to mail you lots of things, so please, please, please do subscribe. I've got about 2,500 subscribers so far, by the way. Lawyers, museum people, and people who are getting increasingly interested, and majority are from overseas, by the way. The next one. We look at all sorts of things. I've started a podcast. I gather that Joe Rogan took about 15 podcasts before we got to his defining style, and Trump was happy enough to go and be interviewed by him. I haven't done 15 yet, I've done 5, so bear with me. It'll be a little bit of time before they're perfect, but they're getting traction. Also, we have a list of all the sort of UK restitutions, at least one of which has been mentioned by Amy already, just to sort of, the reason why I started it, I wanted a single source where I could go to and actually discover information about restitution. And you know, there isn't one.
Sorry, I disagree with you.
Please disagree.
Yes, Museum Ethnographers Group
Yeah,
actually has definitive lists.
there are, but in terms of depth of articles and things like that, there are precious few. And there are other websites where you can get other information, of course. But in terms of a UK perspective, I think this approach to listening to the public and going out there, using the media, exploiting the media to actually help define what policy should be. They've set up a working group, a cross-party working group to help with restitution and spoliation. And as a consequence, last year, first ever repatriation of major Indian items, which were in the museum together with some Benin bronzes and also some Native American objects. Manchester, this is a good example of what Cristina said about ordinary objects. The Manchester Museum last year, or this year rather, repatriated 170 or so ordinary domestic objects, including what are called these doll shells, shell dolls, which were produced by women in Northern Territories. They are painted, decorated for use by the children. Very, very ordinary items, not Parthenon sculptures, not Benin bronzes, just ordinary items. And I think the real key here is the role played by the organisation known as the Aboriginal Institute, Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders Studies, who have, over the last few years with government approval, formed themselves into a body which has been going around the world prospecting effectively for items, Australian Aboriginal items, which they can research and recover. And they've been recovering thousands of items. So this is a demonstration of the importance of working with these organisations who are helping British museums understand the process of repatriation. Framing, I put in a piece from Exeter, the chief Crowfords, regalia. There have been some significant repatriations made there. Interestingly, this year they made another repatriation of a headdress. Again, it took about 18 months to actually negotiate with the Exeter Museum, but nevertheless, I think that was significant. Jesus College, Cambridge, a couple of years ago, that was a student body who recognised that this Benjie bronze that was sitting there in the dining room had been looted from Benin City back in 1897. That's the only place it could have come from. It was in fact traced back through the donor who had given it to the college, to that looting of Benin City. And the college felt duty bound to honour the fact it had been stolen. Next, Cristina. An organisation I've been working with closely the last year or so is the Pitt Rivers Museum. And I think this is a particularly interesting case study because for the last some 6 years, there have been a series of meetings and discussions held between the Pitt Rivers over a series of really quite small personal ornaments which belong to the Maasai tribe. In fact, they managed to research these 5 particular ornaments and discovered that they were actually personal ornaments belonging to 5 particular families. They had obviously been removed from a warrior from those families in conflict and somehow had arrived in Oxford. When the families identified the objects, they then began a process of what should we do with these objects. And in fact, the decision was made to actually keep them in Oxford rather than repatriate them, even though the Pitt Rivers felt that it was almost certain they were going to want to repatriate them. The decision was made to keep them because it was a process, they called it healing and reconciliation, which again, pick up on Amy's point, is really what regional and university collections are doing more and more of. Understanding that there are grounds for recognising, acknowledging the crimes which have been committed, and in order to bring peace and reconciliation with those former owners and ancestors of those objects, to listen to them and to understand what their goals, what their requirements are. In this particular case, Maasai warriors, when they fell in battle, were left on the field of battle. They weren't actually taken home to their communities. And the Maasai community felt, we have the other slide up as well. No. The Maasai community felt that rather these ornaments represented their own heroes, their own warriors, and that because they were being well looked after at the Pitt Rivers, therefore they should stay there. It was a decision which took 6 years. It surprised the Pitt Rivers, I have to say, but nevertheless it does prove this point that repatriation is not always the only solution when looking after culturally sensitive objects. Okay, the next. In fact, the process involved a great deal of coming together of the Maasai together with the Pitt Rivers, and it even involved the gifting of 245 cows to these Maasai families. I think it was 49 cows per family. And I had a podcast which went out yesterday, talking to Laura Van Brocke, the director of the Pitt Rivers, and she actually got involved in herding the cattle. So you see, this is the multifaceted role of museum directors. Next, please. This is another example of a case study of a very simple object. Nothing grand, nothing like a Parthenon sculpture. This is what's called a Kenya sun hat. It's it's Sarawak, which is now Malaysia, formerly Borneo. First one. Next one, please. It's quite a simple object, but it has a great history because the British White Rajas, who were operating in that part of the world for just over 100 years, about 1895, 1896, were trying to expand their territory in the region. And in doing so, they were quite happy to slaughter the men, slaughter the women, loot, and do all sorts of other appalling things. It was a British-led sovereignty at that time. And this sun hat would have been worn by a woman of the Baden community. So therefore it has great resonance, great meaning for the role of women in the conflict. It wasn't just the men that were killed, a lot of the women were killed with their children. But the other point about it was that there was incontrovertible evidence of looting. On this particular sun hat, it had been acquired by one of the family, the Brooks family, going back in the early part of the 20th century. And it had been given to a museum, the Sapaen Museum, and so on and so forth. Eventually, it was quite clear when the community brought it to the attention of Pitt Rivers that this had been looted. And for the first time ever, the Pitt Rivers decided it was right and proper and fair and responsible to repatriate the object. I think that's very encouraging, because the Pitt Rivers have been, if you all know the Pitt Rivers Museum, it's a wonderful cluster of Victorian vitrines, and it actually, it's extraordinarily difficult to contemplate actually recovering anything from that collection because of the terms of the collection. But actually they have finally started to repatriate. So, next. I think the fact that it was their first repatriation is exceptionally good news in terms of the outlook. And again, picking up on a point of Amy, when I'm talking to Laura on the podcast, she talks about they have a big team of people. They see their role now as helping smaller collections, bringing that experience to those smaller collections, which again I think is a very encouraging development. Next. Just very quickly, you may not know, but one of the new campaigning areas is for Mongolian antiquities. Mongolia has been a country that for 300 or so years was cut off, isolated. And then in the mid-19th century it opened up again, and particularly Russian, but not just Russian, Western archaeologists and others started storming across the Mongolian plains, looting, taking things, not giving back, in excavations, typically taking a lot of material which they had promised to leave in Mongolia, but in fact took with them and took back to St. Petersburg or Paris or London. So at the moment, Mongolia is running a campaign to research items which have been looted before making a formal request. It will be some time before that happens, I suspect. But nevertheless, it's the early stage of a repatriation process. Next. This is actually the museum, the Genghis Khan Museum, which was built in Ulaanbaatar and opened just 2 years ago. And next, they have a good collection, but unfortunately not. Most of the very big and most of the most important items are now in St. Petersburg, or actually in China as well, or in other Western collections. They've identified 34 other countries where there are major Mongolian items, which they are going to seek to bring back. And there'll be an exhibition at the Royal Academy next year, where it's called the Art of, I think it's called the Art of Mongolia, something like that. But it's part of a strategy to inform and alert people to their lost heritage. Next. So I just wanted to really begin to pick up on this point about how. Because we have been running a campaign now for 2 years, next, about a group of objects. They're called tabots. They're sacred plaques from Ethiopia. They're so sacred that you and I will never see them. There are 11 in the British Museum. None of us will ever see them. The curators are never allowed to see them. The director of the British Museum is not allowed to see them. And the only people who can decide whether they can be returned, the trustees, they're not allowed to see them either. They were stolen, they were looted. 8 of them we know, 9 of them actually, were looted in 1868 at a place called Magdala, where an emperor, Tewodros, the British went into battle with Tewodros to recover some hostages, 15,000 British troops against a couple of hundred Ethiopians with spears. We had cannon, we had muskets. And the troops just went mad and raided not just the battlefield, but the sanctuary, the church, and the treasury and other buildings. So for 22 years, the government of Ethiopia and the church in Ethiopia have been trying to recover these tabots without any success. The British Museum Act, which Amy's referred to already, is very clear. They will not release anything. Nothing can be de-accessioned, with just a couple of exceptions. Those exceptions include duplicates, paper, I think after 1850, items which are so badly damaged they can't possibly be recovered, and one final category, items the trustees consider are unfit to be retained, and what's more, serve no educational purpose for the museum. Now, I would argue, and in fact I think man and woman on the Clapham Omnibus would argue, that an object that can never be exhibited, never be photographed, never be studied, is unfit to be retained in a museum whose objects are educational. So, next, we have put in 4 freedom of information requests to the Information Commissioner's Office. As a public body, any citizen can apply to the ICO and say why, and query information requests which have not been fulfilled. Our questions to the British Museum are quite simple. First of all, we ask them, have you debated the tablets and considered whether they should be returned? And secondly, if you consider them fit to be retained, please explain why. Quite happy to explain why the Benin bronzes, Parthenon sculptures should be retained, fine. So why don't you explain why the tablets, which can never be exhibited, why they're fit to be retained? So we put in 4 requests since 2022. Next slide, please. And as you can see, the response we've received has been truly shocking. Can we keep it on that slide for a second? Well, okay, you can put the first bit on. Now, there were several documents which, I've got to compress this because of time, several documents which we asked for. First of all, they said there wasn't a document. Then they said there was a document. And then finally, they produced the document. This is actually a document from Hartwig Fischer, who was then director of the museum. And just to read the top, it says, there were various options. This is specifically about the tablets. There are other pages, by the way, but I just put this one page up. There are various options before the trustees, each offering opportunities and risks. So I think this is a clear case of a lack of transparency by the museum. We are arguing that this is not, this doesn't fall within the normal catchment of, we can't deaccession. These are objects unfit to be retained. And the reasons why they're giving us are just shocking. They are saying, and the ICO is supporting the British Museum, which, again, I find shocking. The ICO is saying that they are right to withhold this information because it's, quote, likely to prejudice relations between the UK and any other state. Now, remember, the Ethiopian government, the patriarch of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, have all not just written but met with the British Museum to request the return. God knows this organisation needs some good PR. After the last year, and we've actually made that point, after the revelations of thefts and things, which came as no surprise to me having worked in the museum, I find that a truly astonishing statement. And the final point. They also believe, and again this I find surprising, that public interest favours non-disclosure. Now, this is not the Ministry of Defence. We're not talking about, whether or not we should go to war with Russia or whatever. We're simply saying, please tell us why you're hanging on to these sacred items. By the way, in 2001, one tablet was returned to Ethiopia it was discovered in a church in Edinburgh. One single tablet. A public holiday was declared when the tablet was returned, and thousands of people lined the road from the airport to Addis Ababa. Just think what would happen with 11 tablets. And final slide. Just run through. Put up the next, and that's it. So the frustration levels are very high, returning heritage, as you can imagine. And I think, as Amy has hinted, that clearly UK legislation, heritage legislation, in many ways is no longer fit for purpose. Remember, the British Museum Act is now 60 years old. The National Heritage Act, which is the V&A Science Museum, is 40 years old. Like Amy, I believe it is time that we had a national policy framework. It's fine talking about these individual museums, and clearly the message is clear that regional and university collections are increasingly positive towards communities. Whether they're proactive or whether they're reactive, they're nevertheless positive to those communities. It's the national collections that matters. And frankly, nothing is going to happen without changing law. Forget about, whether we should, shouldn't. It is absolutely essential that we change the law. And the only way we can do that is if we can actually begin to approach government with the right sort of information to inform and educate government into why and how. So it's a case of how do we get there, and I think that's really the purpose of the next part of the 20 minutes of conversation. I have my views, and we're probably going to share them right now. Thank you, everybody.
With Amy, I just kind of want to open it up. I'm sure you have questions and reactions, any contradictions, because we just want to, get everyone thinking about these ideas. And later on, we really wanted to focus also on perhaps people who might have something in mind that they want to apply for repatriation. So we'll talk about that later. But for now, let's talk probably a bit about kind of your takeaways from the discussion. Anyone? Yes.
No, I just want to ask about other countries. Have they done anything similar in studies or experiments?
Do you mean within Europe looking at
Yes.
returning? So Germany has a central contact point who, if any museums are interested in repatriating, they're meant to get in touch with, and if any indigenous nations or nation states are interested in finding out what's in Germany, they should get in touch with them, but only then at that point do they do a national survey to ascertain which museums have which ancestors and belongings. I'm trying to think if anyone else has done anything broadly on the research side.
Well, they're far ahead of us, although it has to be said, I think you made this point, it hasn't yet been totally successful.
No.
Let me just say where we are on this campaign, because I've been working with a firm of lawyers with these freedom of information requests. We wanted them to be taken very seriously, and I didn't just want them to be, tossed into the pot and tossed back again. And we've been looking at the response by ICO and decided that we need to take a new step forward, a new approach. And my view is that government in Europe, to answer your question specifically, they face identical problems, identical pressures about repatriation, historical injustices, and there have been a multitude of committees formed, advisory expert committees formed. Some have been more successful than others. Not all of them have delivered a great deal, but I certainly think they're going in the right direction. Why? Because forming a group of people involved with restitution, lawyers, obviously, people from civil society, students of ethics, museum professionals, but not politicians. The remarkable thing about all these advisory committees is they've excluded politicians. To address all the various issues involved with repatriation, good and bad, and including, by the way, source communities who've been critical. So in the Netherlands, for example, they've included people from Suriname. They've been critical to those debates about how the Netherlands goes about addressing its colonial heritage. And they've come up with recommendations and papers which are beginning to filter through their Houses of Parliament. In Belgium, although it's been quite heavily watered down, Germany's got through quite quickly. France, as usual, gone off in a completely different direction. There have been all sorts of varied results, but there's absolutely no doubt that formation of these expert committees can help advise Parliament. There are two problems we're trying to get the UK Parliament to buy into this. I'm talking from a UK perspective, so forgive me. But if you want the recovery of an item from anywhere in the world, from a British museum or V&A, you face the same problem. You've got to change the legislation. Problem number one is that everybody gets fixated with the Parthenon sculptures, which is the biggest distraction to the restitution debate. What on earth do the shell dolls from Northern Territories, Australia, have to do with the Parthenon sculptures? Nothing. It's an insoluble problem anyway, I suspect, with the Parthenon sculptures. So they keep debating restitution and end up talking about the Parthenon sculptures and therefore getting nowhere. The second thing is that British politicians have no knowledge. They're not informed about these issues. And we've got to inform them. That's our responsibility. We've got to get them up there. They are massively distracted under the previous government it was all about showing our great empire prowess. Under this government, maybe it's going to be different. I'm hopeful, like Amy, but we have to give them the material to help them make their minds up. Right now, it's a blank piece of paper. I'm sorry, it's such a long answer to your
I
question.
just want to come in on that and say that I don't necessarily agree with the expert committees because they have held a lot of things up and the progress has been slower, whereas in the UK, where aside from national museums, the museums have the ability to act independently to return, there have actually been greater numbers of returns. So the minute that you put it in the hands of government, although the national museums need a change in the legislation, you then run the risk that it gets slowed down by bureaucracy, diplomacy, etc. So it's kind of the policy briefing that I pulled together is about making the UK government understand that there is a benefit internationally, soft power, etc., to doing repatriation and to enabling national museums to do this, but saying, don't make it a kind of political instrument to kind of hold up repatriation discussions so that your diplomats can come and take politicians can come and take photographs and have that PR moment, which they often want, because I think that has really slowed things down elsewhere. So although they have these committees and they have these guidelines, it's putting out, they have a better reputation in the press than the UK does for doing this work, but actually many museums in the UK are getting on with it and just doing it, and you have to think about what the risk may be if it suddenly becomes in the hands of politicians. So that's my only caveat to that.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right when it comes to the regional and university collections, but national collections can only change their habits by legislation. So it's going to end up in Parliament. So whilst none of us, I agree entirely, want politicians ruling and running around and opining on issues of repatriation, if a coherent set of guidelines, a framework, can be constructed, which they can sign off, then just walk away.
But it has to be funded.
Yeah.
And that's the other issue in other countries. Some of them have got funding and some of them haven't got funding. And you can't put guidelines out without funding behind them because nothing will happen. And that's what's happened elsewhere in Europe.
Just wanted to jump in on that one.
Yeah,
And
okay.
say, I think totally agree around the legislation change to national. I just wanted to flag that there's also legislation change regarding the Charities Act for government structures that are replaced by charity provision,
Yeah.
which also poses, it takes essentially that ultimate decision making away from the museum. There's another hoop to jump through, and time and also cost in producing a legal case for charity provision can be required.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree, and that's in my policy briefing as well, that they need to be included on the sections, either 12 and 13, I can't remember which numbers it is, that allow other museums, to act on repatriation on I think it says moral grounds.
Yeah.
And if the ones that have to go through the Charity Commission were given that, and originally it looked like, and Paranor probably, you were alluding to, originally it looked like they were going to be, and then they clarified, actually no, that doesn't, they hadn't quite clarified, and it was really gutting, but that came in. That
We're hoping it might go through with the new government, but we'll
yeah,
wait and see.
me too, I hope so.
I just want to ask you a question. Thank you for really helpful. And, I wanted to ask a question about the term indigenous. That's one question I have. In the human rights lingo, it seems to be broadly defined. In a lot of usage, it seems to relate to the U.S. Canada, certain very specific instances. And your example of Canada recognizing through a treaty the indigenous nations, that facilitated the work. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the slippage between the broad usage of indigenous and therefore human rights and material should be returned, and then the specific usage, if that's something that comes into play.
That's a really interesting question. I don't think I've necessarily, because my own research does focus on what is now the US and Canada, so I don't look at all contexts, but I think even in under I believe the definition of Indigenous peoples is left very well, it's not clearly defined, and so that's one of the problems with UNDRIP, I think, is that, and it's not perfect, and the UN are not perfect, as we know, so there's issues with trying to use that, but in a way, because it's not defined, I think that's enabled a number of Indigenous peoples to feel that they can instrumentalise that for their own purposes or their own aims. In terms of specifically, I think that is the downside with the way that the National Museum Scotland case study worked, because of the fact that the Canadian government had this treaty with the NISCA, whereas I've got colleagues and people that I work with who focus on South America, and the lack of recognition is causing huge problems. So I've got one colleague who is working with the Mapuche and kind of trying to make international claims from places like the Smithsonian, but the Smithsonian, when they repatriate domestically, they have federally recognised tribes in the US, and they go to the federally recognised tribes. So the minute you go outside of those contexts, it becomes really difficult, and I think that that's one of the next key things that needs, as well as looking at how places in Europe can do more of this work. That's one of the things that needs to be really understood, because a lot of the excuses around, oh well, we don't know if that person has the authority to make a claim, we don't know who to repatriate to, now the government are contacting us of that country, and should we go through the government? And yeah, I've spoken to people that do that work, and there doesn't seem to be a clear answer, but the message is that talk to the community and look for ways that the museum can support upholding their rights and their sovereignty in ways that work for them. So for some communities that's about digital repatriation, because they don't want it to come back yet, because it will get stuck with the national government, for example. I don't know if that answers your question. But
Yeah, that's helpful, thank you.
Yes, please.
Hi, thank you. The last time restitution laws changed in the UK was to do with recognising Nazi losers as spoliation. I think that the process that's instituted is wholly inadequate for the scale of looters and dubiously acquired objects in UK collections. Is there, however, anything to learn from that process of changing the law that could apply to objects used in colonial context? And are there things that should also be avoided?
Keep lawyers out of it. It's been a smorgasbord of legal fees and precious little returns. And if you really want to put it down to one thing, it's lawyers. They had a field day. Which is again is why one wants to arrive at a formula which means you don't have to keep going to court for every single object. That would be my take on it.
I think, although there's often better records for Nazi looted art that make provenance research easier, I think that some of the learnings from how individuals and institutions have undertaken that provenance research should be applied to colonial collections, because there is a real skills gap across Europe for repatriation generally, but also for provenance research. And so we don't, I always say that museums need to be ready for if and when the funding comes, and one of the things that they need to be ready with is people that can do provenance research, and it's even more complicated in this scenario. But I think that's one of the things that, there are learnings that can be taken from Nazi looted. I think in terms of things to avoid, and this more applies to the law in the US that's around MAGPRA, so that's it's not quite answering the question, but the only problem is once you put into law in black and white the criteria upon which people can and can't claim, that can be used as an excuse to not give someone something or someone back. And I think that's the slight danger. So you have this scenario where new legislation would outlive new governments, and that's really positive, but at the same time legislation can be used against people in a way that the current flexibility offers more opportunity for. So the work that I do in the US, they look at, oh, well, when we work with Europe, we can apply to claim, any type of cultural item in theory, so long as, we can prove that we have a link to it. So I think there's a something about not being too, how do you make a law without being too specific, which probably isn't super possible. And a lot of Indigenous scholars saying, we don't want Western laws to solve, that cause colonialism to solve problems that were caused by Western laws. And I totally agree that there are a lot of lawyers looking at this now, and they try and look at it through a legal lens. And more people doing this work is absolutely, what needs to happen. But when you think about ways to do this in an anti-colonial, equitable, transparent way, legal training doesn't always tie in with that, I don't think. I went off on a little tangent, but...
I had one thought thinking about this is, I think one of the base problems is that Western museums and Westerners in general, they approach this stuff as property. They think of it as you were saying, as stuff to own.
Yeah.
And it's not stuff to own. It's not like you go to the shop and you buy toothpaste or you buy something, you buy a gold bar or whatever. It's not the same thing. These are cultural things that are viewed with different meaning, a different set of meanings, and then that can't be dealt with property law, which is how we're dealing with it. So I think just changing that attitude would be a huge win. I mean, there's, we're dealing with Roman law, right? That deals with absolute property value, and until that changes, until we think well, maybe it's not about market value. Maybe that's not, I think we're kind of stuck, because they're just talking in these completely different cosmologies and have no connection to each other. And it's just, what are you talking about? Both of them are just, I don't understand you at all.
I totally agree. I'm so glad that you said that, because that's what I've found, is that when museum professionals are involved in the ceremonies around repatriation, around caring for these non-human living persons, their views on how they look at cultural items or completely change, and they understand that they are ancestors and that they need to be treated as such. And I think that's why it's difficult, because if you have to be involved in a repatriation to understand why it's important, then it's going to be really difficult to change those. I don't know what the answer is, but I think as long as they're still seen as property and something that can be owned, I completely agree. There's not going to be that shift in thinking. Go ahead.
Regarding your website, so it's obviously great to have something that people can come to, and they can find all the resources in one place. Perhaps the cumulative effort is also going to help others to reach out for their objects as well in the future. I'm just wondering, in terms of leverage, if reaching out to certain organizations or certain people would want to help further. I don't know, how the legal aspect plays into that really, but it could be a hindrance or not. But that could push everything forward, and then maybe have a more, I don't know, like a process for everybody else to follow, which would be easier for, let's say, any other nation to, refer to when they want to go about, just applying for something, because there's so much in this city alone that people can apply for. So some sort of framework that could help the people, and could that be something that could be worked on?
I still think the what's happening in Europe and what's happening in the United States for people like the Smithsonian is a useful model for the United Kingdom to look at more closely, not replicate in exact, but I sort of compare it with slavery. It took people to campaign to get out there with information. There isn't enough information out there beyond the confines of groups like ourselves and scholars like Amy and the museum curators who are getting younger and younger and therefore have a very different view on labelling, not just whether it's about restitution. It requires much disseminating more information, and so the more websites like mine and others out there can do to get that message across and get it to the right people, politicians, members of civic society and so forth, I think we can build a bigger head of steam. There's no doubt that it started. There's absolutely no doubt 5 years ago it wasn't anywhere near as big and persuasive as it is now. 20 years ago it wasn't there. When I worked at the British Museum, people couldn't even spell restitution. So, joking apart, it's happening now, and the more people can get behind it, the better.
Yeah, I think that's why my website kind of maps which countries are open and what their policies, laws and the process to go through are, and then gives examples of museums. So for the UK, for example, it looks at which museums have repatriation policies and already conducted repatriation, with the aim being that other nations and indigenous nations could look at that and then use that for their own model to say, oh, okay, this was what was successful for the Niska nation, for example. How can we work with that and look at the National Museum of Scotland rather than maybe knocking on the door of the British Museum and our limited capacity, all the emotional labour that goes into making a repatriation claim. But one website is not going to change the world. But I just found that, for example, saying that the National Museum of Scotland hadn't had any claims for 2 years, that was very common. Oh, we haven't heard from any native nations in the US. Oh, have you contacted them? No. Oh, okay. Well, we have a procedure on our website that's buried on case ///. So it's trying to bring those things into one place, and then I think what's been really interesting is that a lot of European museum professionals have been using it to inform their own practice and looking at, okay, what works about that policy and why have that museum been able to convince their trustees more than I have at my museum, for example. So, yeah.
Yes, please. What you hear me people pointed out maybe the limitations of the current model that we have, and I was interested, the through line you both spoke on about media and the power of the press, and as a young person, I think the finger pointing at the discourse around the Parthenon, I do agree it can be problematic, but I do think that people, especially as young as myself, wouldn't have been aware of the discussion without kind of exposure to those maybe big brand name problems. So I'm curious what both of your take is on the power there and leveraging media, kind of the same way we're talking about the law.
I think it's really important. So that's why a lot of my work talks about how museums communicate about the issue with their visitors, and then thinking about the press and the media and the public more broadly. I think that when we think about how to convince trustees, one of the things that I found in my master's research a few years ago was that consistently public opinion is that, for example, the Parthenon sculptures should be returned. And so if you're saying you're holding them in public trust, well, the public say they should go back. So I think it's the sort of museum visitors and the British public should be part of that discussion, not to say that they should have control over whether ancestors and belongings are returned, but so that museums can't hide behind the fact that they're keeping them in trust for those people. And I think that the Niska Nation's use of the press to really leverage and put pressure on the museum is really, really interesting and really powerful. But I also think that there's more discussions now between museums and Indigenous nations and others when they're doing repatriation about putting that out in the press to try and apply pressure to other institutions to say this is becoming normalized practice and this is becoming something that the public are interested in and that they should expect of their museums. And anecdotally I hear a lot of people say that they get more visitors coming in and asking, are you working on repatriation? Are you doing this? Are you doing that? And to a certain extent, they need to be answering those questions before they end up in the press, because the press are sending a lot of FOI requests not saying anything about FOI requests in general, but the press sending FOI requests to try and make it a controversy and try and make it this culture wars still, that actually, you know, I'm not saying the majority of the British public don't agree with, but a good number of them, you know, don't want to buy into that narrative. They just want to know, what are you doing to act on this really globally significant issue? And I think there's really great work happening. And just to say one more thing, that in the US there's something called the ProPublica project, and they have been tracking which institutions in the US have been acting on NAGPRA and holding them to account, and they've been pretty successful with that, at basically shaming. And because NAGPRA is not enforceable, and that's another problem with bringing in a law, is that it probably wouldn't be enforceable, and that's what they found in the US. They've been successful in kind of putting pressure on the ones that aren't acting on that. So that's another, I think there's loads of avenues for the press to get involved.
I mentioned Glasgow. 25 years ago, there was a famous repatriation of a shirt. It's called a ghost shirt, which was recovered from the famous battle at Wounded Hill. And the Glasgow museums were, you know, this was the first repatriation request they'd faced. So immediately, instantly, they got, you know, a wider engagement with the local community by going to the press and actually saying, can you help us? We want to know what the community feels. So 25 years ago, they actually got the press involved. They had a huge amount of feedback, which understandably was, this is an item which should be returned to the community. So it really can work. Amy's mentioned other examples, but it really, really can work. Unlike the Parthenon sculptures, which, I mean, like, it's now 65% or something of the British public, last poll, wanted the sculptures to be returned. But I'll tell you one cynical observation, which is politicians, when they're out of office, are pro returning the sculptures. Politicians in office don't do anything about it. E.g. Boris Johnson, and E.g. Ed Vaizey, who was arts minister and the Conservatives, who had opportunities to actually do something about the Parthenon sculptures and did nothing. And now he chairs the Parthenon reunion project to get the sculptures returned to Greece.
But if more museums started talking about the work that they're doing, then it would also help to counteract what we both agree is, you know, too much about the Parthenon sculptures, which is kind of, again, like, we're not doing great work, we're not doing great numbers of returns, but it would be great to kind of shift some of the reputation so that we get more nations and more Indigenous nations approaching our museums and making the case. You know, when you have more claims, you can make the case better for more, you know, resources to do that. And if you've got a bad reputation, like, you know, I speak to a lot of Indigenous people who are like, well, I'm not going to approach the UK because they only associate it with the British Museum and the Parthenon debate.
We have a lot more kind of heritage activism in some way to kind of go out there. Of course, there's a lot of provenance research that needs to be done, first of all. And do you think, are museums getting more into provenance, like funding provenance research? No?
I wouldn't. I think that the money's not there. You know, there are pots of money that they can apply for and kind of say, oh, we're going to use some of this to do provenance research, but there's not enough, and it's not clear that they can apply for that. So a lot of them only do the research where they've got the claims in. And I think, you know,
so that's kind of like the chicken and an egg kind of thing.
Yeah.
We don't know what's there. We don't know where they came from, or
so like with something like the Philippines, I think, you know, making those requests of, you know, can we have a list of what you have, and can we start to have a conversation, and not letting them use provenance research as something to delay the work being done.
Okay, quick question, and then last question, and then we'll have a break.
Great. And the question is, could something be done about making a central fund that many people could apply for, and then it would be basically judged who gets it first, and then you constantly go around the world, whether it's crowdfunding or whatever else, to just build a fund to make it more accessible?
I think there needs to be some sort of central mechanism for a number of, you know, for training and skills programs, for funding, for testing. You know, we talked about testing for pesticides and other harmful chemicals. which is often a big problem when items want to go back and into use. And so I think there's a lot of ways, especially with the UK being geographically small, you know, compared to somewhere like the US, I think a central mechanism that is solely there to support and provide funding would be a really brilliant development.
It's very disappointing that the V&A made a major appointment to Provenance Research, and he left just a few months ago after serving only about 3-4 years, I think. She might have something. Which is a great shame.
No, he's at Art Institute Chicago.
Yeah.
Executive.
Yeah.
Provenance.
A great shame, because he was, you know, he really could have mentored and led the way in terms of UK provenance research, and, you know, structured something which really would have had substance. There is also criticism that provenance research slows things down, but I agree that overall it's an essential part, an essential component in the restitution mix. But I think I think his departure is going to slow things down with V&A, for example.
All right, let's have a quick break. And a well-respected representative from the, you might say, source cultures in diaspora. So I'll introduce. Let me introduce Meaghan first. So Meaghan Backhouse is a lead curator of the Global Cultures Collections at National Museums Liverpool, and the chair of the Museum Ethnographers Group. As well as her curatorial role, Meaghan has worked for many years in collections management and documentation. In addition to working on collection policies and procedures informed by originating communities and decolonial practices. To be in conversation with Meaghan after she gives us kind of, I asked her if she could give us the policies. What do you do if you want to return something to be returned? So she will do that. And after that, Mark Watan, who is a devoted father, husband, and esteemed community leader of a very active organization here called IGRA UK charity. So it's Mark is from the Mountain Province, but the group is an umbrella group of various indigenous cultures from the Philippine Cordillera. So we wanted them to be in conversation after, so let's begin with Meaghan.
Cristina, thanks so much for inviting me. I've enjoyed the first panel so much, so I'm really looking forward to the conversations that are to come. So I'm Meaghan Backhouse. I'm the lead curator for Global Cultures at National Museums Liverpool. I've been there for coming up to, maybe it is exactly 2 years now, I think. So some of the policy that I'm about to talk about was in works and agreed just before I arrived, but I was charged with writing the procedures when I came into the position. So I can talk around all of this. There are a lot of words on the slides. I'm sorry, it's so that you could see the policy and some of the procedure. The procedure actually is a flow chart to make it slightly easier, but I thought it was important that you see the actual words and the terminology that was there, rather than me just talking around things sort of euphemistically. So really quickly, for those people who might not know Liverpool real well, or the UK, I'm going to tell you where and why. So there we are on the River Mersey, approximately 180 miles north of here as the crow flies. Key port in the empire, really important port in the empire. Liverpool had by 1830, Liverpool companies had the monopoly on all trade with Shanghai and Hong Kong. From the 17th century at least, there was active and very important trade with all of West Africa. Liverpool was the center of the transatlantic slave trade for the UK, made huge amounts of money off either the trade or indirectly through the economy. And then once transatlantic slave trade was outlawed in the UK, they continued to make huge amounts of money by supporting the southern US states, right through the Confederate War. In fact, the very last Confederate warship surrendered in the River Mersey because they knew that the gold that they had on board would not be confiscated and sent back to the US. So Liverpool has a really, really important part to play in empire. After the end of the slave trade and the economy, it continued to have a very important role in empire. The Benin punitive expedition was launched from Liverpool and returned to Liverpool. No question about its place in the empire and the history of the empire. So that's why I wanted to start really quickly with where we are. Also, what becomes slightly more important is that this was also how the UK was fed during World War II. All the supplies coming from North America and South and Central America came to Liverpool. So it was the second most bombed city outside of London as a result. And that has bearing on things later on that we'll get to. So, really quickly, this is National Museums Liverpool, 7 museums, and is that right? 6 museums and galleries. Liverpool itself has the most museums and galleries outside of London. So, starting at the top row from, well, my right, your left, the World Museum. That used to be called Liverpool Museum until 2010. Next to that is the Walker Art Gallery, Merseyside Maritime Museum. Then to the bottom, that's Lady Lever Art Gallery, as in Lord Lever of Unilever fame. He built that for his wife. Then there's the Museum of Liverpool in the white marble building. That opened in 2010, which is why we're now called the World Museum, because Museum of Liverpool and Liverpool Museum was too confusing. Next to that is Sudley House, which is a historic house owned by one of the many families that made their money on both slave trade and the empire. And then this is the International Slavery Museum, which is actually located in the top floor of the Maritime Museum. And I believe that and the Museum of Liverpool are the newest museums. We were made a national museum in 1986 when Liverpool recognized that of the almost 4 million objects that are in these collections, it couldn't afford to care for them properly. And so the only way to make sure that they could not be sold off was to nationalize them. So that's when we became a national museum. We are national. We are governed by a different set of legislation than the V&A and the British Museum, and that becomes board later on as well. So really quickly, this is the Blitz. So you see the far left-hand picture was the museum in the 1930s, the late 1930s. The one in the middle and the one on the right are pictures from early May 1941 after various nights of Blitz. The museum is connected to the central library in Liverpool. The central library took a direct firebomb hit, and the museum suffered as a result. So we're not sure how many of the collections were destroyed in that evening alone. We do occasionally find pieces that get returned to us mysteriously. Can you tell us about this odd object that Granddad found in a skip someplace? That museum number? We'll talk about that later. And it's worth saying that as well, the museum didn't reopen until the mid-1950s. So when the war was over, the government made money available to museums that had lost their collections. So our collections were, or the collections that we care for now, many of them were bought with government funding. So we bought them from museums like Norwich Castle Museum, which was clearing out its ethnographic collections because it didn't feel that it fit their remit anymore. We bought them from collectors, from auctions. We were sent sort of the cast-offs from the British Museum when somebody wanted to give them something and they didn't want it, they sent it to Liverpool. And then we also have the largest number of welcome dispersal objects, so when welcome dispersed their collections, Liverpool got first take on all of those. So that means that large numbers of our collections, our documentation is that much further removed from the original documentation or communities from which they came. Because we didn't always get everything from when the objects came in. Right, so restitution and repatriation policy. I just want to take a minute to talk about policies and procedures. We heard a lot about them in the last panel. And I want to talk about them really quickly from somebody who's had to sit in the room while they're being written and debated in museums, both at NML but also at other museums that I've been at. And it's really important to remember, as we already know and have heard, that museums wouldn't have these policies and procedures if it wasn't for the decades, if not almost coming up to a century in some cases, worth of advocating, requesting, demanding returns by indigenous and originating communities, and to a lesser extent some museums and those colonial settler societies. They are the reason that we are finally doing the work to look critically at the collections in our care, how they came to be in museums and outside of community control, and to learn more about the colonial context in which that caused that rupture. And so we're now being guided more and more by communities on how to redress that damage. But how would a museum respond to that really emotional and deeply morally grounded argument? Policies and procedures. What better way to do it? I mean, I know I make light of it, but I understand museums do have a duty to all stakeholders. That includes the people who pay our bills every day, in the national museums, those are the taxpayers. So we do have a duty to all stakeholders to do the research into collections and respond to requests in a thoughtful, respectful, transparent, and ethical way. And policies and procedures should ensure that happens. They also help to uphold the Washington principles of a just and fair solution for all. A legal ethicist once put it to me this way by saying that in the global north, policies and procedures hold institutions to account. If museums work outside of policy and return things without being held by the hands, we can tell ourselves we're doing the right thing, but it can also come off as really patronizing, or it can seem as charity rather than being actual justice. At the same time, our policies and procedures are exhausting, and they demand a lot of resources in terms of time, emotion, and money. There's also an inherent power inequality in the whole process, fully aware of that, and starts with the fact that a claim needs to be made by the community group, which means a great deal of research has to have been done beforehand. And it ends with the reality that not everything will necessarily go back, despite working through every step with the museum, hopefully in good faith. And if we aren't careful as we work through our procedures, we risk alienating those communities and those originating communities, and reinforcing the current colonial power matrix by reinforcing global north systems of knowledge and knowledge reproduction, and by not recognizing and working with indigenous knowledge systems, and only favoring traditional art historical provenance research, which relies on transactions, historical quote-unquote facts, and the perspective of the collector or anthropologists and historians. But we can talk about all that later. I think the best thing to do, we talked a lot about policies and procedures, but really is to define our terms. We have to start with definitions, I think, and I find this with the leadership team that I work with as well. We have to talk about terms. So originally the policy at National Museums Liverpool was just repatriation of cultural artifacts. And when I came in, I said, well, no, we need to at least include the term restitution. Of course, now I get questioned why we don't have rematriation there as well. So as we can talk about this, terms are changing constantly. I mean, I only updated this policy last year. It's already, there are elements that I have taken from the first panel that will come in the next time I have to update it in March. So thank you both for that. But this is where we're at. I think it's really important, though, that we did bring restitution into this discussion, because in the intervening years since the policy was first written about 5 years ago, we've been listening more and more to communities, and it's been clear that it's not just about the objects. Museums were fixating on the objects and on ownership, as we've said already, and art historical provenance research, but that paradigm doesn't work when we're talking about colonial collections and indigenous knowledge systems, or systems of care and ownership. So communities of origin made it very clear there's a lot more to returns and the work necessary to reach a return. And if we in the global north currently looking after these belongings don't recognize and appreciate all the aspects of the work, nothing will change. It will all be hollow, and we won't be in a position to develop any kind of relationship potentially going based on trust. But as I say, this area of work is constantly changing. The language is constantly changing. So I might give a whole different talk next year. Okay, so these are the definitions. Mentioned the Charity Commission. Charity Commission uses these definitions for restitution and repatriation. As it was alluded to, a lot of museums are charities, so the new charity law could apply to them. With the updated Charity Commission guidance, some museums, or their trustees anyway, do have the ability to apply to the Charity Commission to restitute or return cultural material heritage using ex gratia payments if their quote-unquote worth is judged to be below a certain monetary threshold. And that's important as well. However, this mechanism, as been alluded, is not open to national museums. I remember the day very clearly in February, earlier this year, when we received ours. The head of my directorate was not very happy. It was a long afternoon, but it's worth everybody, if you're a museum looking at your legislation, that's about the extent of my knowledge on this one, so I'm not going to go any further on that. But the other thing I want to note here is that restitution is very much a legal description here. It's rooted in law relating to stolen goods and or unclaimed material goods. So this can relate also to objects from European contexts as well. But these are other definitions, and the ones that I use to inform the development of our procedures anyway. These definitions come from a variety of sources, both through my work at MEG, but also, just doing my research, much like Amy did, trolling through lots of different policies and procedures online and through other provided by colleagues as well. And I will say that the term for community is one that I lifted almost verbatim from the Australian Institute for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies. They know it. I have credited them. They're very happy with me doing it. But it's not extensive and it's not exhaustive. That's the point of it. But it gives a description of what community is rather than going through the indigenous, originating, who are these people, blah, blah, blah. I have you'll see in the procedure that the policy that they are referred to as claimants. We need to change that terminology, but it's there. But that's what we work with. You'll see the most important point is what's in pink. When the policy was written in 2019, I think, and was working its way through leadership teams and our board of governors, it was worded differently. Then lockdown happened, the murder of George Floyd happened, the Colston statute came down, and we are governed by the Department of Culture, Media and Sport, and the then head of the Department of Media, Culture and Sport took a very active interest in what museums, especially national museums, were doing. After those discussions, this is our definition of what can be returned. It is a word soup, and it is very open. I think I need to leave it there. We can talk about that. We're hoping to engage with the new government in good time. So, these are where all the real words are. This is the first page of two slides that show our policy. As I say, it isn't exactly what we wanted it to be, but it is a start. You'll see that the term claimants is towards the bottom here. What's important as well is that, oh, sorry. It's like, hey, did that mine? Also, what's important is that one, it mentions our founding legislation, which is the Merseyside Museums and Galleries Order, because that is, we actually operate We operate as National Museums Liverpool, but our actual name is National Museum Galleries and Museums Merseyside. Also, we will enable discussions that include listening to originating communities, Liverpool communities, our Respect group, which is a group set up during the development of the International Slavery Museum to make sure that NML was being responsive to Liverpool's Black communities, and it was an equitable partnership in developing that museum, and colleagues, and specifically through our ethics group. So what that means is that any time that we are working through a claim, we have to engage portions of the Liverpool communities. It's really important to NML that our Liverpool communities are engaged in everything that we do and have a say, have the opportunity to have their voices heard. So it's left right open how we engage them, what communities are engaged, and any engagement would absolutely happen in conjunction with any communities working through a claim with us. So it would not be NML making that decision, we would hope to make that decision with communities. How do we address this? Is NML even in the room? Is this something that communities want to have on their own? A lot of it, we hope, would be a sort of hearts and minds operation. Explain to communities, what are we talking about? Why is it so important to us go back? And for them to have their voices heard as well. We do have an internal ethics group. I think we're the only national museum that does. The ethics group is an advisory body, but it still holds some weight. And then also when it comes to, bring together an external independent panel of experts with access to legal advice, if necessary, to review any claims based on legal ownership before it is taken to our Board of Trustees. So the external independent panel of experts was also something that came in when the new definition of repatriation was instituted. That's all it says. Who is on this independent panel is absolutely not defined and never will be. The legal representation should hopefully cover everybody, not just NML. This is making sure that everybody's working in a way that, under our current framework, is covered. But it is supposed to be an equitably chosen panel. This is the second page. It's still quite extractive in some ways. So this is tying our values with why we should be doing repatriation. You can see here, we will gain invaluable knowledge about the collection, and the standing and reputation of our organization will grow nationally and internationally. It's still quite extractive. We appreciate that. But I think this is also one of those winning hearts and minds exercises that it was felt we might need to include. And then this is the final page. It's another important reference to Liverpool as Liverpool's history and role as an important port within the empire, and a lot of the pain that was visited on the empire as a result of Liverpool and through Liverpool. But also it speaks to a little bit of what Amy has talked about in terms of soft power and cultural diplomacy. And again, it's about what the museum and the country gets from this, but it is also, an effective way of winning hearts and minds, I think. So that's the policy. It's on our website. I can give you the link also. And then this is our joyful flowchart for working through the process. Let me tell you, there's no way to make this pretty. I have tried. I really tried. I even have a work placement right now who's a graphic artist. And he's like, oh, I could do something. I said, I think you really need to write a thesis, not like my flowchart. But, so this sort of lays it out. This part is what we expect to take the longest. So this and sort of going back and forth with communities. So the idea is that all research, all work is done with communities rather than we do our bit, you do your bit, and then we'll bring it together and report. The consultation with communities is important as well, and that will add time to it. But we want to make sure that we're representing the case as clearly and thoroughly as possible in the Global North framework that we have to put it in. So I was really interested about the Nisga'a Nation record showing up and doing it orally and recording it. I absolutely think that that needs to be fed into the actual written procedure. This is just the flow chart. We do have a much more formal written procedure as well. So what's important here is a formal request. So I know people want to know what that means. A formal request should include an introduction to the claimants and their representative body, if they have one. It doesn't have to be, we're quite happy to work with individual communities. Doesn't have to be national government by any stretch, or a museum. It can just be a community. So the introduction may include an explanation of the continuity between the community from whom the cultural artifact originated and the current community making the request. It could. A representative body should explain how they are authorized to represent the originating community. Details of the cultural artifacts should be included. This should include how the cultural artifacts were moved, if they know, and how those artifacts were obtained by the museum, also if anybody knows, we don't always know. The reason, and then the reasons for a return. For example, it's exhaustive, really, the reasons, but for example, it could be the cultural, historical, or religious importance of the cultural artifact to the descendant community. In addition, the claimants and the representative bodies, where applicable, are welcome to provide any additional information they feel we need to make an informed decision. Well, not me, the Board of Trustees. This might include letters of support from the community or other communities, partner organizations, national bodies if they want. It could include information about any other requests that are planned or in the process, advice on any archives, publications, organizations, or individuals whom it would be useful to consult or involve in the process as well. The Board of Trustees will be notified the moment we have a claim, and so they will be involved. They will be updated on that fairly regularly. How involved they get is really up to them. We do have a representative on the ethics committee, and so my guess is she will be involved in this from an early point. We would probably also aim to start developing this independent panel early-ish as well, but that's all up for negotiation. I should say as well that in the written procedure, we've written quite clearly about Indigenous knowledge. Not all of this has to be any sort of written provenance research. It can absolutely be oral, it can be pictorial records, it can be whatever community thinks they need to represent themselves. We're open to all of that. And that it should be as much a back and forth. So in a perfect world, and it rarely is, these conversations would have started basically from day one. For example, Cristina has come to look at the Philippine collections at NML and asked immediately about our repatriation policy. Great, we can start that conversation from day one. We're all for it. Whatever makes it easier so that going through the process isn't quite as painful. However, we are also aware that it is a painful process, and so we will be happy to work at the speed of community as well. If they want to push it, we'll push it. If there has to be a break at some point, we're not going to assume that because things have gone quiet, it's over. We understand that things happen all around the world, and it's not always. What we're doing in museums seems really important to us, and on community it's important for a minute, but then something else takes over, and all of a sudden, this is not a priority. So that's sort of where we're at. I think, under our resources. So that's it. Sorry, I think I probably went a little over, but we can talk through things.
That was a lot of information.
Yeah, I'm so sorry.
I got my introduction already, and if you can tell by my Should I stand or sit? Or, okay, stand, yeah. You can tell by my accent I'm not from here, you know. I was born and raised in the United States, and you wonder, like, what does this guy know about his culture? Well, that's the big thing, right? So many of us who are born in the diaspora found this connection in terms, from our elders who wanted to share the culture, who wanted to make sure that their legacy and what our ancestors' legacy would be able to survive. So I was lucky. I was born in California, and the elders over there at that time, from my community, were able to share with us a lot of the culture and the traditions, and as best as they could, even with language barriers and whatnot. So some of the ways that we learned was usually through action, by music, by singing, by dance, and whatever artifacts that they had. So for a lot of they call us second generations, part of the things, we're all born whole, right? We're all born whole, but I think for us second generations, there was a sense of emptiness in terms of like knowing who we were at that time, especially in the 80s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. And so people from my generation were really looking for a way to kind of like find that foundation of who we were, who we are, not just as Filipinos, but even more deeper as Igorot people from the Cordillera. And so like, for me, we were lucky to learn from, there are different provinces around the Cordillera, and we were lucky to learn from the traditions of almost every province from that area, because we had representatives, elders who were from every area, and they would share as much as they could, as much as we were willing to listen to about their area and their culture. And so I was able to kind of, me and a handful of other people, even though there was a lot of youth at that time, were able to kind of take what we could and share onto the third generation and to other second generations afterwards. And so one of the things I found, I married my wife, who was another Igorot woman, second generation born in this country. And of course I ended up, as you can see, I ended up moving over here. And I found that many of the issues that I found with our community are happening here, although a little bit different. But they're happening within this community. And so what we've done, Igorot communities around the world have created organizations. Usually they're called BIBAC organizations. BIBAC is the acronym for the main provinces like Benjie, Ifuga, Bontoc, Apayao, Kalinga, but including other places like Abra and mainly Abra and as many as we could that represent the Cordillera region. And here in the UK, we have our organization that started off with my wife's parents, who decided to kind of like try to, and this is very common amongst Filipinos in general, that we try to find ways to reconnect, and we were talking about the heart, right? Try to find ways to feel at home where we are abroad. And so the organization here is not called BIBAC, but it's called Igorot UK. And Igorot UK started off as a small organization of Igorots that around it started in East London, and then that kind of grew. And now Igorot UK is more like the leader of, in terms of just being the head of an umbrella of different organizations. As we are very tribal, and and each tribe likes to try and find their own home and represent amongst their own people. So we have Kalinga organizations over here. We have Ifuga organization, and usually we have mountain province organizations, and they all come under the umbrella of Igorot UK. So we have this growing community of people here, and one of the things that part of our mission as Igorot UK and the BIBACs around the world, one is networking. So what we're calling it now is this term that's being coined amongst the different organizations. We're calling ourselves the Igorot Nation, because right now being Igorot and even Filipino, it doesn't just limit ourselves to the island, to the home country. We're everywhere, much like our fellow Asians, the Chinese, or like everywhere. And one of the things that's challenging for us is really trying to make wherever we go home. And we know that many of us are not going to move back to the Philippines. Many of us are going to have children here. Many of us are going to stay here, and we don't know what our children's and their children are going to do. Are they going to stay here or leave? But our biggest function, other than networking and trying to make those who come from the Philippines feel at home, is to also make sure that we do our job and duty to pass on the legacy, just like it has been done with me and other fellow second generations, that the legacy of our ancestors continues. So cultural preservation, obviously. So one of the biggest questions that, like probably we're gonna ask later on would be like, really about, because you've already talked about policies. Yeah, and that's something that's just, wow, But in terms of like being able to connect with other museums and whatnot, trying to build relationships so that we could have accessibility. And the last time I saw a Philippine exhibit was when we had what we call the International Igorot Consultation, which was a big old consultation, international consultation of Igorots, who came over here in 2002. And yeah, we had some displays for Igorots and people from the north and in the Philippines, and that was really nice. And it was perfect for that moment in time. But coming back and forth until I finally moved here in 2013, I haven't really seen too many displays in terms of like whether it be Igorot artifacts or artifacts from the Philippines in general. And so, since part of our mission is really about cultural preservation, just kind of wanted to ask those questions about like how can we really push to get Philippine exhibits out there, so that my youth, third and other second generations and first generations can all come and witness what is already there. I mean, repatriation is one thing, and there's a lot of issues regarding that, because we understand that like some of those things were purchased from people who really needed the money. So it was, but of course under certain circumstances, right?
It's always
it's always a little bit kind of odd, but we recognize that. But because those artifacts are here, let's see them. So what is the process in terms of like really trying to push these kind of exhibits out there for our people? And the Philippine population is a growing population. I mean, like NHS is huge, right? With Filipinos, and it's 35K. And you think about them, that's going to multiply because they're going to have partners and children. So that's going to multiply. I think the numbers right now are a little bit skewed with I think it was like 0.2% of growing Filipino population, and that's not even counting like people who are still in the process of documenting themselves. So, with that growing Philippine population, I'm sorry, I'm extending that, but like really, how can we approach, how can we build the relationships with the museums so that we can see these things and make sure that our people can find a sense of rootedness by seeing their culture here in the diaspora.
I'm working, it sounds like I'm going off topic, but I'm not. In the Northwest, where Liverpool is, are huge Latin American communities, very similar, and they don't see themselves in museums as well. So right now we're working with Latin American communities in Liverpool to make sure that they're seen. So really, it's just a question of going to a museum and saying, we're here, and we'd like, can we see what you have? Can we know what you've got? I mean, Christina's done some inventorying already of some of these collections. And just starting to understand the curators. I'm not going to say everybody's going to be jumping right now. This sounds horrific, but we are being decimated in terms of funding, and so our resources are tight. So if you don't get an immediate response, don't take that as we're ignoring you. Take that as these people are overbooked, which sounds awful, but it's true. But I would say just start contacting local communities in particular in your area and say, please can we have a look at this, and what can we do, and what, I think one thing that museums would like to know is what communities, what would they envision out of a partnership? What would be their goal? Because that helps us develop funding applications. Because we can come up with ideas all the time, but that's still the colonial museum saying to you, I've got an idea, can you fit into my box? Rather than you saying to a museum, this is what we'd really like to see, and this is how we'd like to approach it. We'd like to be full equitable partners with you. You know, can we find some funding to work together? Because that also allows not only the museum to find funding to do work, but then to pay members of the community for your knowledge, for your lived experience, to ensure that it is an equitable relationship and that you are getting the story and the outputs that you feel are important, rather than what the museum thinks will sell, which is often a problem. A bigger museum will have a marketing team, right, and an exhibition team who may want to somehow say, oh, well, we can bring in, who are the people that this will bring in and spend money in that museum? Right. So you want to go in, if you develop with the museum, if you can, but if you have ideas ahead of time, say, we have these ideas, we'd really like to see this. Is this something that we can work on together? And then, I mean, that's sort of...
This is all being recorded, right?
I hope this
oh, yeah, there it goes.
I hope this is making some sense really to you. But I think that's the goal, but also just knowing what every museum has. And I will say, you're right, museums don't display Filipino material, and a lot of that is because they don't see it as empire, right? So much emphasis, and I'm finding this with the Latin American collections, they haven't been really documented properly, they haven't been displayed well, and they aren't getting the attention that they're supposed to have, because so much of it, the idea about empire is very clear about the colonies, exactly who were colonies, who were members of the Commonwealth, who were members of the Commonwealth, that sort of thing. But when you sort of explain, no, they're here, thereby they are colonial legacies. There's a reason they came here, you know. It's starting to switch the conversation. Right now, and colonialism is a very tight box for most museums in the UK. So it's also about, in order to get the funding, how do we find the words to fit the funding boxes? Because that's the other problem. We're going to have to find external funding, by and large, to do the work.
The words, the semantics, like that.
Sometimes funding grant applications can sometimes have very specific things that they're looking for, and if you can't hit those if you can't tick those boxes, then you won't necessarily be at the top of the pile for funding. Our funding bodies haven't caught up to where a lot of museums want to take the work, so we're having to sort of cajole them through the back door, sort of.
You're right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It sounds really like gatekeeping, and I know it sounds like gatekeeping. I think we're trying really hard not to be gatekeepers, just to be transparent about the restrictions that we're working under. And I say that not just as a national museum. I've worked in university museums. I've worked in small council museums as well. Everybody's got their own sort of area they have to try and work within. But museums are really keen to do the work with their communities, especially local communities. It's just, they don't always know who the community is either. You know? So you don't want to just go out to somebody and go, you look like you're an underrepresented community. So I think it does help museums to know who's out there and what people want to see as well, because otherwise we're just curating for ourselves, and it's of no use to anybody.
Yeah.
Candy has a question.
Sorry.
Yeah, I'm from the Philippines too, and I'm just wondering, because you're talking about you're putting the responsibility on the community to figure out, you know, how to put put it all into the right words, to know exactly what they want when they don't even know what the collection is.
No, you're right.
And also on the point of how the Philippines is not a proper colony. We were invaded by the British. We were not colonized.
No, I know that, but
lots of things were looted.
But that's not necessarily how it's being taught or conceived of. And so that's what, while we recognize that, it's about making our funders and the wider public understand that history, because they don't. You know, they're
So do
very,
you have a kind of outreach so that the communities that you'd like to work with are aware that this is possible? Because it might be that they don't even know it's
yes,
possible.
no, and that is part of our problem, is museums trying to get that information out there. 100%. I'm not saying that it's only on communities, nor am I saying that the communities have to have the words. That's what museums can do. The museums know the words that we need to write into our funding applications. But again, if we go to a community and say, you look underrepresented and we have this idea, do you want to work with us? That's not the right way of doing it either. So there has to be a little bit of give and take in this, and sort of I can't think of a museum that wouldn't welcome a community representative saying, I'm from McNaught, I'm really interested in what your collections are. Can you share that with me? Is there a way I can come and see them, or a group of us come and see them? Can we have a conversation with you and start that way? But I think it is also useful for the museum to know, you know, what is it that we can do to help facilitate.
Juan, I'm getting a bit hungry. But we will now begin the last section of the seminar, which is a film screening. It's a documentary, observational documentary of a particular instance of repatriation. It's a bit different from the kind of national sort of exchanges with objects, etc. So it's a very personal, very intimate, but hopefully it will give a sense of what are the possibilities for the return, and especially how, in this sense, it has become it's an ongoing project, and it has built so many deep and profound relationships, and also I guess realizations from this one act of what we say an act of kindness that actually pushed this story. So Marian, Pastor Roces, if you're familiar with Marian, will now kind of introduce the film a bit, and then we will speak.
All right, you're still here. Thank you very much. This film has to have a macro view, and I'm glad that Tina, who gathered us all here tonight, thank you very much, began with a macro, the large picture. And in a sense, all of us who are interested in these processes do need a bit of a binocular vision, like the big view, have a sense of what's going on with the Elgin marbles on one hand, have a sense of what President Macron decreed, which hasn't been fully, well, it seems that it's easier said than done after 4 years. But the bigness of it, the epic scale of the state-to-state repatriations, of course, move at a glacial pace. And the discussions in UNESCO have been going on for 50 years. And then there's the thing that needs to be said. Just because we're not talking about parts of the Parthenon, doesn't mean that the tiny basket, and we've seen that, or the small hat, is of any less value to the peoples who have them and who want them back. All right, so it's a kind of small and granular view, and a large view that we have to keep in our heads at the same time. The big policy issues, but also the human, the intimate, and I think this is my best way, Billie and Benjie, of introducing this film, because it does bring us into the granular, it does bring us into the intimate, and it does bring us into a level of repatriation, and indeed shifts us to repatriation, in the sense that it happened organically. But before I cue Tina, I would like to thank Tina, because the entire project of SOAS, of the Mapping Philippine Material Culture, that has been going on for I believe 5 years, Tina? The mapping side, the website.
2021.
2021. Well, the fact that it exists, that SOAS has actually put in effort, Tina has put in a tremendous amount of effort putting, uploading more than, nearly 10,000 materials from all over the world with the collaboration of 33 museums and going. The fact that it existed, that it exists, has made what happened to Benjie and Billie happen. So with that explanation, so we do these large scale things, and then things happen. Thank you all. It's longish, but you're here. Thank you very much. I am really delighted to be the one to introduce Benjie Manuel. This is Benjie's first trip outside the Philippines, and really nice. Of course, I have to introduce Jovi Juan, who made the film. And Cristina Juan. I'm sure you have a few questions, and I'm not going to say much. I'm just really going to give the floor to Benjie and Billie, and for Jovi. Any questions for any of them? Right, so there's a question.
I guess I was wondering about what inspired you to stay away from the idea of a museum or library and turn into a house of stories.
I guess I'll have to answer that. I make museums, that's what I do. And so this is the one time that it occurred to me that this is not a museum project. Mainly because it was actually about 20 years ago when I realized, after about another 20 years prior of textile studies, in a previous life I was a textile scholar. It took me a long time to realize that all of the words that I was collecting in association with Philippine textiles were not nouns, are not nouns, they're verbs. And I could have hit my head on the wall after 20 years of work in textiles. I mean, I speak the same family of languages, but it didn't occur to me that they were verbs. They are verbs. And the reason for that, and that's why you wonder about your own professions, the reason for that is that I was so used to the museological procedures of annotating and accessioning and putting it on record. And in the passage into an accession record of a museum, they become nouns, they become objects. Now, I have nothing against the objects. I have had a 50-year love affair with objects, as you can imagine all curators have. But to be stunned by this realization that it took a long time for me to understand that practically everything related to textiles, not just in the Philippines, but in island Southeast Asia, these are processes that are described rather than named. And so it doesn't seem right for this transfer, this return, to lose the sense of the transfer itself. And I'm so glad that Benjie agreed, and I'm so glad that Cristina agreed, and Billie agreed, that the storytelling is far more powerful than object collecting. Although Cristina and I and Benjie and a number of friends are now working very hard to ensure that the House of Storytelling is going to have museological provisions for preservation, for security from theft, and fire, and fire. And may I just say this? I'm sorry, I'm overlong, but something happened. There's another after what you saw. There was another event, and I had invited a really great architect. His name is Sudarshan Kadka, and out of the Venice Biennale, he presented at Venice his own methodology for co-designing buildings with communities. And it was presented at the Venice Biennale successfully. And I thought I should invite this architect. And we had another event where Benjie invited a group of people, another kind of storytelling, which involved carpenters, people who are good with bamboo, people who are musicians, weavers, yes, anybody who uses the house, who will use the house. And I'm going to turn over the sound. I will shut up, but I just wanted to say that it was wonderful to have that discussion with the architect and realize that the house itself is a musical instrument. And that the way the house is constructed has specifications about the use of bamboo, what kind of bamboo, what kind of flooring, because it has an amount of give, and all that dancing will have to take place on a floor like that, and once it gets going, and then the bamboo, it's giant bamboo, it's this thick, the bamboo becomes a percussion instrument of the house itself. And so I'm now waiting for the architect's proposal. After that, we go on from there. So it goes on. So Benjie, well, that's essentially, in addition, would you like to say something?
Yes, sure. Yukifu, you might not understand that. That's how we say evening. Yukifu po, yeah, actually, maybe we really should answer that. Yeah, she's my mother. That the connection that comes out when all these things transpired. A relationship between a mother and a child. That's how Afan Penala created. It's a relationship between the mother, daughter, grandmother, daughter, granddaughters. The entire family comes together to create as, you know, a beautiful self. Why not use it in for Gónô? Yeah, because you will get a very great idea. But when you have it in the community, it's more empowering. It's really sets a community in order to dream and to realize something for themselves. And even more teaching them how to preserve it, teaching them how to recreate it, teaching them how to pass it on to the next generation. And that would be more significant. Hi, po.
Yes, may I ask, I want to ask Billie whether the Lake Cebu that you returned to was the same one that you left. And then I want to ask Benjie, you know, I was really struck in the video that there were all these people saying, I've never seen the ritual, I've never seen that dance. So what did they know, and how did you reconstruct? Did you know about all of those rituals? Did you have to reconstruct it or find elders to teach it in order to recreate it with the objects that Billie brought? So Billie, what was the world like when you arrived?
The landscape felt a little different. There were roads, we weren't going around on horses anymore. So I spent a lot of time on Benjie's motorbike, going up into the cities in the hills. Because for me, I have to say that apart from the objects themselves and the stories, that actually going into communities and spreading out the photographs, as you saw, was one of the most moving things ever for me. And having people pick up a photograph and say, oh, that's me, was extraordinary. And to be able to return those as well to people and to find out who they were now. And so in terms of my relationship with the people, it felt possibly even deeper than it did when I lived there.
But when you left, what was your relationship with the objects you brought away? Were
Oh,
they
well,
just souvenirs?
That's not, no. It's very hard to describe that because I feel sometimes like a looter. And I do have some shame. I have to admit to some shame about having held on to them for so long. When I brought them away, I need to say that a lot of them were given to me, and some of them I bought. And there was even an occasion when I was actually leaving on a truck, and I didn't want to go. I was distraught, but I was very sick, and I had to come back to England. And it wasn't until I got all the way down the mountain that I realised that there were things on my body that were not there when I had got into the truck, initially. So, well, just before I got into the truck. So things had been given to me. So, and yes, it didn't feel great to be having these things after a while, but they were my familiars. They were my familiars. They were my way of keeping my connection with what had felt like the most formative time of my young life. So, yeah, there were more trees. That was great. And there was this guy, and many more people.
I'd like to, from Benjie, to respond to Candy's question about, so there were all these rituals that people were saying they never saw those rituals. So I don't know how it was for you.
Sorry. In our family, we actually have rituals, especially when planting.
So can you be louder?
When we do upland rice planting, so we usually have rituals. But when the Tabalis Book Senior High School started, because it was initiated by our elders who were coming together, so I used to be their, assistant of the elders who conducted several rituals. So I shared to Dr. Pina that I have been witnessing 8 several rituals in my life before that rituals happen. So it leads me to goosebumps. You know that. And it's also my first time to witness that last ritual that we did. It goes this way. An elder who is a Kamagi,
Whoever.
yeah, a Kamagi Smith.
Smith, that's right. Yeah.
We go around to the side, and certainly we go back to the circle. She digs a hole, and he puts a strand of abaca in my hand. Then we bury it on the ground. Then he said, connect its end. If its ends end up separately, it would be tells us a bad omen. But I won't watch it. I did it, and everybody witnessed it. And sir, after a while, he said, "Pull it out." I pulled it out. Oh, the 4 strands of abaca connected to each other and form a circle. And that's very amazing. See this? And for that, because of this return, it's the spirit, it's the ancestors who guide us. It's like, it's object, just like an umbilical cord that connects us to our ancestors. Because we believe that when a child born, after cutting the umbilical cord from its mother, when it dries up, it usually detach its umbilical cord detached from the child, and we usually keep it and replace it with something else. We call it telusuhan. So those objects would be telusuhan for a child, for good health, prosperity, and everything. So each object represents a very significant, thing to us. Like what Sir Johnny did, he also returned his object in the field. He's a retired education supervisor in Region 12, and he used to work in Santa Cruz Mission in the 80s after he left. So he told us that these objects are the ways of life of the bodies, and it's the life of itself. It's their life. So see, because each object connected to each other, it's how it works in the community. The tanalak, the birth, marriage, and everything. And each beads, example, it takes the grandparents usually collect one or more beads until it reaches the granddaughter to actually complete the sets of necklace. It represents many generations to complete, and how it connects to its life of the community. And actually the object, I flew it from my Tabao town to reconnect it with by funk, and it's actually here. If please, the Yakum.
Where is it?
Is it?
It's right there.
Can I get it? Is it okay?
Well, in her,
Yeah.
the tinalak actually flew back to London. It will fly back to Lexington. It's now a flying carpet.
It's on loan to London.
It's back for a while, so it's quite mobile now.
I want to say just a little thing about having given many of the things, well, just about everything back. And I gave something to Benjie just on Sunday that I didn't know that I was going to give back, but it turned out to be incredibly significant that I did. And when he took it from me, he said, "Now you're free." And I understood that now I was free from the responsibility of caring for these extraordinary objects.
Both.
So it was very important.
I didn't want to interrupt
Oh, they're
what
both
Billie was saying. The idea that slipped out of Benjie's mouth, apparently, about now you're free. And I don't think you even knew what you were saying, but apparently Billie just said to us over lunch that she feels free from having. Now, this is an unusual, museologically speaking, if you don't mind my curatorial annotation, but it's very rare now to have something of this size.
Yeah, maybe.
In fact, very few exist.
Even in different collections, it's
So-
very rare. Even in like big museums.
There's none. Zero in the big museums. The National Museum of the Philippines does not own one. There's another museum that owned one, and for some reason it's gone. All right, just museological annotation, ikat, with ikat. Now this is warp ikat with abaka, which is a bast fiber. It is among the rarest techniques and the most difficult techniques of production. People who know their objects know that this is one of the hardest art forms to achieve. And but this is really a fine example. So now let's travel back.
Did you talk about what the effect was when he came back?
Yeah, Benjie. We'll open the other one afterwards. I think this is the one that Billie brought back, and the other one is Gervais Hamilton's.
A lot of curators are probably gonna
Because
of
scared of the way we're handling this.
What do you say about the
Scary?
yes, constant handling?
The constant handling without gloves.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
How do you? Yeah. How do
these
you?
objects are very spiritual. You can see you have goosebumps from foot to head. You know, and what's make it more important now is that if you would have books, then place it on the shelves, and you would open it, it won't serve its purpose, right? This one, if you do it that way, it won't serve its purpose. So when it goes back to our community, this is what happened. Young weavers who visited this textile, able to recreate something. They are challenged, they are inspired with, they take, took an inspiration from it and to create something which is out of their mind.
So this is new.
This is new.
It's pretty good, huh?
At the front.
Yeah. So they now have a reference.
So did she look at Billie's Tinala painting?
Yeah.
To do that?
Yeah, they visited.
It's alive now.
It's continuous thought. It's really, it flows in the bloodline of the community. And then to recreate something.
How long did it take?
It takes 6 to 7 months.
Who made this painting?
The one is in the exhibit.
Yeah, that's right.
So this has happened since April 23. Somebody has done all of this.
Yes.
From taking each individual strands of abaca, tying them together, from doing the design,
The design
dyeing.
at the center is called this is Gamaya Logi. This design tend to prevent a weaver from sleeping from his husband. So it's done in 6 to 7 months. So a woman has to resist from sleeping.
No sex.
It's really
Part of the reason that they're not doing it.
This is it.
So
One thing, I have another one.
So is it one person weaver doing this?
This is one
Always
person.
one weaver.
Yeah.
But it's a community, it's a family ways of life. They help each other.
Yeah, you really can't credit it to one human being.
There.
And also you couldn't do it without the support, because when when a woman's weaving, she's not doing anything else. She's weaving, that's it. So,
someone has to help her.
Yeah.
Mother, can you help me? Again, sorry. Thank you. I have brought a lot, sorry. And this one, is quite different because it's thick.
Yes.
It's very thick. So when the weaver is done by Sanduinaling, it's an old weaver who remembers what her grandmothers did in the past. So it allows them to, to bring back their memories, what they have done in the past.
Yes.
I can imagine this actually.
So to inflect the point again, this happened after the repatriation.
And it would not have happened without the repatriation?
What happened?
The
Benjie
designs
answered
hadn't
that.
been seen.
Hadn't been seen in 50
They
years.
hadn't been seen in all those years, yeah.
There's no reference.
So-
Yeah.
There's no reference.
Yes.
Well, to be perfectly precise, I published a book on textiles 30 years ago, and there is a Kumutinara there, and there is one Kumutinara in Lake Cebu that was made based on the photograph. So there's one that's based on a photograph, but these ones are not based on photographs.
I just like to make clear, there are several Tiboli weavers in the community. We have the new Gamaba, Barbara Upo,
Mhm.
who is on Tenala also.
Yes.
But she can do this.
She can do that.
Yeah, like Yabman.
Yeah.
Is there a symbolism for the butterflying and the void?
Oh, in here?
Yeah, I was seeing in the other one too, so I was just curious.
I didn't catch it, sorry, I didn't.
The symbolism
Is there a
symbolism
of
the negative void and the butterflying from the center?
Yeah. It's Gónô speaks about bow and arrow. This one's about toffee. So it's like a place or location. It can be on a corn, like skin of corn. That's what it represents. But all of this tells a very deep meaning, all of these things. And it's quite new because we usually perceive Tanalang as it must be thin, shiny, that makes us, allows us to classify which is the first class or not. But we can see that Tanalang can be this way because it's how it works in the community. Supposedly, not in the eye of the buyers or is that someone who is very interested in it allows the community to create something which is not by the instruction or by the orders of the one who buy it. It allows them to navigate things which something coming from their heart.
Benjie, are you saying that before you started to see this kind of heritage objects, the weavers were weaving according to commercial specifications?
There are some. There are. Mostly, they weave because they want for living, to support their students or their children, to support their family, to support the school of their the daughters, like that. But this is something different perspective that creates something without looking into that it might be bought from me. Because that's the common perspective. That's how we perceive the community. Like my mom, actually, usually weave because she wants to sell it, because she wants to have to give allowance to her apo, to her grandson who is studying at the city. We want to sell it, but it shouldn't be that way. Because before, like Baifak did, it's not used for commercial use. It's something sacred, something important, something that connects us to the world that nobody can imagine. It's a connection with the spirits, inspiration with the ancestors. It should be like that. And people should understand that in indigenous communities like us, it's not all about money. It's senseless. It's about our identity, about our culture. It's about how we survive in this strange world today. That our children might speak like this to you and tells the best that we have in our community.
Benjie? I will be remiss as a student of these matters if I do not attempt a greater precision. And the greater precision is that there have been books, and the books have been, it's not just my own. One of them was actually written by one of our guests here, Sandy Castro. She authored a book, a chapter on a book on the Tinalak, which was published in 2000. Yes. So there had been references that were pictorial. But the references, while really adequate, it had been adequate, and the Tiboli people have actually as many as 30 weaving centers of various abilities. But all of it is for commercial purposes. The difference between this post-repatriation, and I'd like to be very specific about this, the post-repatriation production is that this was not made for commercial reasons.
The other thing was with the dances, and a lot of the dancing that happens in the community actually happens in hotels or in other things. So they're done as this performative thing.
Yeah.
So I think like what made the storytelling festival so special was that they were just doing it for themselves. And they were just, it was amazing. I can't even emphasize, like, it was like Woodstock. It was incredible. So it was like everyone was together. Everyone was just, it was so natural. They just get up and play and like dance, and it was unbelievable.
Right. Yes.
Hello, Benjie. Hello to everyone. My name is Carla. So I'm also Filipino, and I just over the last few years made my own journey back, I would say, to my maternal family with roots in indigenous communities in Brunei. So, and that has to do with completely accidental discovery of the connection. I wouldn't call it a return in that I've never been part of that community. And as we know, as Filipinos, there are several layers of estrangement. But I am making the effort. And before this, there was complete silence in my family about the links. And I would like to ask Benjie, what sort of before this, what was the general feeling among younger Tiboli in the community towards the culture? Was there, in my family, I'm sure the silence was down to shame. And that shame was linked to prejudice. So I was just wondering whether kind of these were similar circumstances is in your community or completely kind of different events.
Thank you so much. Actually, that's the first question in mind of when she left and when she goes back. Is the culture still rich, or it is gone, or something like that? Well, we the Tibolis, we are some sort of majority group in our area. Like in local government unit, our mayor is Tiboli. Makes sense. Most of our councilmen are Tiboli. Our representatives in the area is very, very evident. We have that indigenous political structures. We have that indigenous, mandatory representatives are there. And in the barangay level, there are lupuns, there are IPS, also indigenous political structures, and IPNR. That's how things are being, present in community. In schools, like our school, the Tabales Senior High School, we offer culture-based education in the school. We offer, it's a different lens actually. In the curriculum, we adopted the national curriculum, but we implemented before the implementation of senior high school in the Philippines. We implemented 1 year ahead. Yeah. So in the core subjects, we designed it according to what is the mandate, the national curriculum, but we contextualize it. In some other way, we have that specialized subjects. We offer this one, tenalak weaving. We also offer loom weaving. Actually, what I wear today is handwoven by our students at school. Yeah, Billie is over there. Yeah, we have loose wax, brush casting or Manuel. We also have embroidery, this one, cross stitch, beads making and beadworks. We also have wood carving, where we visited the elder who taught wood carvings in school. And the elders used to have engagement in school. They serve as resource persons in school. We allow elders to teach and share about the culture tradition. And aside from that, aside from our school, who is offering that, the Santa Cruz Mission where BIFAC served before I think they way back in the 60s, they already offer culture-based education. They have that TED, they call it tribal education program. So you can see that in Lake Cebu alone, that the culture is still present.
There's no shame.
There's no shame in us because we represented the majority, and you can see that the bodies are very colorful among the, sorry to say this, among the indigenous communities in the Philippines. Yeah, we
I
have.
think Mark has a
Sorry.
Very competitive IP.
Okay, quickly, yeah. I can share something very similar in terms of shame culture because we experienced that ourselves as well. And it's quite emotional when we talk about it because my parents experienced that, and even some of my older cousins. And I was raised in the States and I had to hear it from them. But even I experienced that from other Filipinos growing up in my community. And so one of the amazing things that Filipinos who are abroad have been able to do, particularly Igorots within their own community. In 1995, we had the first international Igorot consultation. And they saw all these people from everywhere came over, and they saw all these young second generation Igorots dancing, practicing the culture, learning the values because of, thank goodness, because of our elders. And because of that, there were leaders who were there from the Philippines, saw this and said, how come they're doing this and we're not? And so it changed the paradigm, that sense of shame into a sense of pride, where Igorot, the term Igorot used to be a term of shame. It was an insult. But then they were able to kind of like change that and make it a sense of pride, And so when I hear this story from my brother here in the South, I think I know why I thought I knew you. Because I went over there and said, hey, yeah, I remember you. But I'm realizing it's because we're kindred spirits from the North and the South. We're all trying to respect our ancestors and bring that spirit to the next generation. And so blessings to you and what you're doing.
Thank you so much. And in addition, actually, in the government educational system, especially basic education, they institutionalize that indigenous people education programs throughout, from grade 1 up to senior high school. I'm sure, hopefully in in the higher education. That's makes sense actually. Our kids, our indigenous children will not be discriminated in schools. That ed has a very good stand of implementing that indigenous people's education program, and it is very manifested in our community. And we are just so blessed that the government is actually, doing something different, and putting an education which is, amenable, which is culture-based, based on the aspirations of indigenous communities, and that's really encourage us to go forward, especially our children. But, hey, grow up, and not like before. We used to be discriminated. Actually, that's very true. But today, through the assertions of our elders and the communities moving forward, and in schools, they instill that education must be like this, and we are all Filipinos. We are all one. We have the same color of blood, and that. So we must be coming together as one people, like that.
One last.
Perhaps one question. There's one over there.
And then.
Yes. Hello.
For Sir Benjie, I have a question, because as a Filipino as well, I was really interested about this conversation about commercialism and performance within, like indigenous practice. Because I remember I worked with, if you're familiar, Custom Made Craft Center in Manila. They like produce or help sell fabrics and products for indigenous communities to fund them. So I was really interested to see that perspective of non-performative and non-commercial indigenous creation. But I also, circling back to the film, I think there was this one part that really kind of interested me, is maybe you or someone else, Sir Benjie. You mentioned that Tiboli people have their secrets and they're not animals in a zoo. And I would love to know what prompted that in the middle of all of this. Where did that come from, and why did you say that?
Thank you so much for that. Yeah, sorry. In the film, there are part that there's a ritual that nobody was allowed to take photos or to have it on camera. So that's a very sacred thing, and they respect that. So, and that's why we say that people must understand that, and they understand it. And there are really part of the indigenous culture and tradition that should be kept among them. Like in medicine. There's something that should be kept among us. Actually. This one, you can see it actually. But there's something that should be kept among us. Okay. So we did say, there's something that very spiritual. By fact have kept, to continue on. For example, by fact have kept it for 46 years already. And
She didn't return them.
She didn't want to return it supposedly. Okay, she came there, so she said that there's one left. You know why? Last Sunday, Sir Jovi took me to her community. So it takes us about 8 hours to get there. And look what did I got. This one. And maybe my mom would tell us something about this. And she supposedly don't want to return this. She wanted to keep it.
So Billie,
Last words, Billie. So, just the confessional now. I didn't want to, and then I showed it to, because this, inside this basket, they're not integral, they came to me separately, and we have the stones as well. Is Bulong Busao, which is a medicine against bad spirits, which I was given to take back with me to England to help me be well and stay well, because I was really very sick when I left. And I do believe that it has kept me well for all this time. And I have to admit to feeling that if I were to give it back, maybe that would change. So what we did was a ritual whereby I kept some, just a few of these, because they're kind of like beads of bark of a tree, I think, and then gave the rest to Benjie to take back home where they belong, and trust myself to the good spirits. And so we did a ritual, and in fact it was then that Benjie said to me, when I gave it to him, now you're free, and I'm free of the influence of the evil spirits, and also free of the responsibility for these things. It's been an absolute liberation for me, this process. I'd like to say that to other people who are thinking of repatriating stuff. Just do it. It's amazing.
Can I just say one last thing? Because just the only reason I'm up here is just to say this one thing, which I haven't told anyone. But it happened when I was shooting the film, the scenes at the end, and there was just all this dancing going around, and unbelievable music, and I was just sitting there thinking, like, I was just watching this whole thing, thinking, like, look what you did, Billie. Look at everything that's happened because of this, you know?
Thank you. And look what happened to me as a result of going there in the first place. I wrote in my, I kept a bit of a journal of this last time when I went to visit, and I put, by the end of our last visit today to the Langdulai Weaving Centre, I felt part of a huge web or wheel or moving cog in a vast movement of generosity, an infinite generosity passing from one to another regardless of time and place, regardless of culture or language or age. That's, you know, it goes around.
It's coming home. Where it's supposed to.
Yeah, where it's Thank you, and we have food and wine.
Oh, there's wine. Do I turn it off?
Yeah. Thanks, Candy.
Welcome.